So let's talk about how language is actually very performative. Hi guys, welcome back to Car Chat. I'm Gerald and this is the Workshop Game. And I just want to kind of kick back and we're going to try to understand this issue I was having. You see, I was talking to my wife earlier today. And my wife is a non-native English speaker. She's Chinese. And so I had to sit there and there's always been this interesting thing where if she calls me on the phone, she has a Chinese accent. But if I'm sitting in front of her, her accent is very normal to me, very American. But there are times where I have to teach her phrases and phenomenology and things like that, metaphors that we use that we don't even really consider. And she was wanting to show me off this AI app thing, which was going to supposedly help her English pronunciation. And I found it interesting that when she was reading off the phone and looking at the phone, her accent came back. But when she looked away from the phone, her accent faded. And this made me think about a lot of different performative uses of language. Like a good example is that I can speak some Japanese, okay? But I don't really speak Japanese as fluently as the natives in Japan actually think I do. I do a type of a performative adaptation, a toolkit that I use when I'm talking to them. So, for example, in a conversation, I'll be like, "son, just to continue on the conversation," or I'll be like, like this, filler sounds. And these are automatic replies because one of the weird things I've noticed about the Japanese language is that it is a call and response language. And what I mean by call and response is if person A says this statement here, then person B must respond like so. And that's very different from English. I mean, we do have some call and response phrases in English too, okay? In English, there is a entire call and response like what's a good example? Just to say, hey, hi, how are you doing? I'm doing well. That's a call and a response. Automatically, you have to respond to it. But the issue that came up was I was thinking about is what does my wife struggle with like certain sounds? And it's another issue I have. Like, for example, she had to correct me in our language discussion where she was like, "Oh, moshi moshi is how you say pick up the phone." But I learned to say moshi mosh. And I go look it up and yeah, that's a mispronunciation caused by my ear not being able to process the sound correctly. I have the same issue with Chinese, now I think about it, where my wife will make a sound, and in order to replicate that sound, I have to say something that sounds completely different to me. And I find it such a strange thing that we don't really talk about when it comes to learning languages. Like, our systems don't really work for what we actually need, because what we really need is for a person to understand these linguistic pairs, these phenomenological pairs. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing that. I'm trying to just put my nail on it. But what do I mean when I say language is performative? Well, a good example is I had a coworker of mine, okay? And she was a black person, okay? And she would come in and she would always be trying to speak Korean because Korean is kind of her thing. Her thing was One Piece in Korea, and that was kind of like her entire frame of reference, what she's trying to build her identity around, and vice versa, okay? So she would say things like "ganseo" all the time, and I'd be like, "Oh, okay." It's when you speak a foreign language to an English speaker as a greeting, and you do it knowing that it's not something the other person is going to know, you create a kind of distance in between yourself and the people around you. You're like isolating yourself from the tribe, trying to say, "I am unique," but by doing so, you've now created a border which honestly casts judgment on you. And that's interesting too. There's a lot of strange imperial parts of English which overlap onto other languages. For example, we have loan words from Japanese. And even when we try to pronounce words in Japanese, like for example, I used to live in Yokosuka, And that's how the Japanese say it. They call the town Yokosuka. But the Americans called it Yokosuka. Do you see like a strange mispronunciation here? And at the end of the day, both are correct. And that's the kicker. You can't say Yokosuka is incorrect when the Americans have been there for 80 years and they say for 70 years, mind you. Yeah, 70 years. Sorry, I had to get this in my head correct. But when the Americans have been there for 70 years calling it Yokosuka, then after a while that becomes the English terminology, doesn't it? Even if the locals still call it Yokosuka because it's their own name and in their own language, it no longer has that relevance. A good example of this is we can look at Germany, okay? The Germans don't call themselves Germans. I mean, they do when they're speaking to English speakers because they know we do not know their actual term, but they call themselves the Deutsch, and they call it home Deutschland, and which gets very confusing because then you have the Netherlands, which is also Dutchland, which is interesting, isn't it? Mind you, I like to add that other than the fact that the Dutch were occupied by the Spanish, they are essentially the exact same group of Germanic peoples in that area, just with a little bit of Spanish blood mixed in now, which is very interesting. In fact, they're closer to Scandinavian now I think about it. But let me not get off on that tangent for today. But English will simply say, no, you are now Germany. The Japanese don't call themselves Japanese inherently. They call themselves of Nippon. And they call their people the Nihon people. Or Nihongo. Or Nihongo-jin, right? So we have these imperial terms where English simply relabels an entire thing, and our pronunciation becomes the only thing that we can understand, even if it is not to the native country's benefit. A good example is another example I can give you is China, okay? We call them China. Where that term comes from is a very confusing mess. But the locals call it Zhenghua. They call it the Middle Kingdom, not China, per se. But they also do call it China because they call themselves the because the CCP, the Communist Chinese Republic Party, also has their own term which calls themselves China, but they also have a Chinese term where they're like a communist Zhongguo, something like this. It's really weird when you get into a country where they've artificially christened and tried to change the language. And then China really has. They've really reformed the language in a performative type of way to make it easier to increase literacy rates, which, to be honest, kind of needs to be done, you know? Well, but language is a performance, okay? Let's get back on the central topic. Like, we have accents for regions, and we have regional dialects, and we have things, and they all form this type of linguistic indicator of I am from this place. Now, you may notice I'm kind of lacking a lot of them. Like, I have a slight southern intonation to my thing, but a lot of people tell me I sound like a European when I'm speaking English, which is funny because I was born and raised here in America, and then I come over to deal with the Asians, and then I find myself code-switching where my English will take on characteristics that fit their comprehension of the language. And I feel like that's what's happening with my wife sometimes. Like, when she's talking to me, she is kind of doing this code-switching thing where she's adopting a dialect, which is not precisely what she normally would speak. And then when she's speaking with other Americans, she's adopting a different dialect, where she's kind of code-switching to a more or generalized English. But I know it's frustrating too, because there are just these small syllable shifts that happen with it, and then because English is an imperial language, we have this type of inbuilt discriminatory basis against any sounds that do not match what we expect to hear. I don't know exactly how I can express it, or how I can continue on with this topic, because I'm just thinking about it in general, and we just kind of play with words. Like, for example, let's talk about politically correct language, which is more of what it is, But I can tell you about a incident, and then you could tell me the same incident in politically correct language, but now it has a different meaning. Or we have different forms of speech, like we have higher English, older English, middle English, low-born English, and all of these form this type of linguistic haze around it that indicates class status and education to tell you where you are. Like, here's a good example. I just thought of it. So, academic English, okay? I have a personal disdain for academic English. Now, mind you, I do think that we should try to keep our language up to the highest possible category, that we should be educating people and trying to keep it up to that chevron. But the issue I've run into it is that academic English acts as a gatekeeping mechanism for knowledge. So there's a lot of advanced knowledge that a lot of normal people can totally wrap their heads around and understand. And if the only problem is that it is exclusively coached in academic knowledge. If you could take it and put it in the words of a layman, then anybody could understand, and I honestly view that as a higher art than simply using large words in order to hide your intent. And mind you, some of these papers are written with the sole intent of using academic language, literally using English as a game to disguise what they are saying. So they will appear to be saying something along the lines of this is, I remember it. What was it? It was there's a Maxine Green paper I read called On the Pleasures of Pluralism, okay? That paper openly is like, I am anti-racist. We are doing everything to try to get rid of racism in the school system. But if you read the subtext and you understand the academic language, it is actually saying we need to create racial categorizations for language in the school system in order to differentiate the results. We have to lower the standard for certain races to bring them up. And that is a type of discrimination within itself. So it is literally using English as a cover, where on the surface, if you don't have the knowledge of the terminology and the framework of ideas that they're operating under, it's saying one thing, and this is the thing they want you to see. But in reality, it's saying this thing, and this thing over here is their actual agenda that they're trying to push. And you see this in the news all the time, okay? Hey, you see the right wing do this, you see the left wing do this. People all play games with language, even if they don't realize they're doing it. And I kind of guess that's my question of the day is, can you see when you are being performative with your language? Like when you're talking to your boss, don't you adopt a different tone than you would normally adopt for a casual speech? Of course you do. Let's be frank, you absolutely do. But the fact of the matter is that the language itself, truck suddenly went by. The language itself is the tool that we need to unlock. And if we can start transcribing more and more of this academic papers and knowledge into common English, how much of it would still survive? I don't think a lot of it. I think a lot of it would be ridiculed by the public and thrown right out. But that's kind of where I'm getting at today. I do have a concept I want to end cap this on, because I don't want this just to be like some kind of dry discussion arguing over words and dialects and such. I have a thing for you guys to look up. I want you to look up square word English, because this is a concept that, it's square word calligraphy. Sorry, I call it square word English because I want this to be adopted, because there is some advantages to other languages that English itself does not have. For example, you can write an entire word in a single character in Chinese. Well, guess what? There was a Chinese artist by the name of Xu Bing who came up with a system where we can literally take that element of Chinese and use English characters to form it. It's just we really haven't sat down and done it. If I ever had enough capital, if I ever had enough money, I would want to pay some people to help me make a font so we can actually create square word English, and then we can just convert famous books into square word English, just kind of to prove my point, because there is a big use case for having English looking like a square Chinese characters. It saves space. It is faster to process. You can inherently understand the information quicker when you don't have to scan the entire line. Instead, you can just scan each character in rapid succession. We use digital devices, and screen real estate on these things is a all-time premium. With Square Word English, this would actually save data. It would save space. It could be completely revolutionary to the future of our civilization. And yet, nobody talks about it. Nobody thinks about, what if we just simply rearrange the way we form words? Because that's a type of performance too, isn't it? Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining me on tonight's car chat. I know this was a little bit random, and me trying to express these thoughts I've been having all day. But yeah, I want you guys all to have a good night, and just think about it, okay? Peace.